Thank you, everyone, for being here. We are glad to have Governor Pritzker here today here at the SJR. This is our editorial board meeting, along with myself. We have community members and then reporters and photographers here. So we'll open up with a first question. Before we open up with the first question, we'll let you, Governor, say anything that you'd like to say in the beginning.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Lisa, and thanks for the opportunity to be here with all of you shortly in the aftermath of my delivering the budget speech for 2021 fiscal year. As you know, last year we were very successful at working across the aisle to get a bipartisan balanced budget passed. One that funded priorities for the state, investments in the future of the state, investments in education, MAP grants, for example, in higher education, and K-12 education, making sure that we're keeping up with our evidence-based funding model recommendation. Early childhood education, which is something that I care deeply personally about and have been involved with for more than 2 decades, and believe it's very important for our state to invest in. And then addressing the hollowing out that's occurred across state government agencies in Illinois for too many years, frankly. But very importantly, also beginning to address our fiscal future and creating a firm foundation for us going forward, because we can't be lurching from one budget to another with a structural deficit of multi-billions of dollars. And that was something that I've made clear, not just in my campaign, but when I became governor, that we have a very large structural deficit in the state, and we just have to address it. It's part of the challenge of the go forward for our state. So this year, we looked to build on the progress of last year and to make sure that we were addressing the challenges that I found when I arrived, not just the ones I knew about before I arrived. And just to give you a couple of examples of areas that we really needed to address and that are in fact addressed in this budget are DCFS. The Department of Children and Family Services is one of those areas where we have enormous, complex societal issues, and we have an agency that has had rotating leadership. It's had, I think, more than a dozen directors over a 10-year period, and it also has hollowed out like the other agencies, but it also has lacked upgrading, updating of policies and procedures. And so that's an area where we needed to put money into staffing, we needed to put money into following the recommendations of the advisors that we brought in, Chapin Hall at University of Chicago. The Annie E. Casey Foundation has a group within it that has been an advisor for us. UIC, the University of Illinois at Chicago, and others. They really came in right after I became governor. I invited them in to help us decide what to do in the agency. And I won't spend all my time on DCFS, but I'm just giving you an example of something we absolutely needed to fund. We did it last year, but there's more to do. And we also needed to make sure like I said, that we change the way they operate and do business. I gave an example in my speech of one of the first things I did after becoming governor is go meet with DCFS personnel, frontline workers, and I heard directly from them what the problems were that they are experiencing. One of them that was raised in the first meeting that I had was that when they would go to visit an intact family, a parent who may have previously had a substance abuse issue, and they've gone to counseling and they've overcome the substance abuse issue and they've gotten clean and they've been able to take care of their child. But the DCFS frontline worker, the caseworker, would show up at the home to evaluate how things are going. And one of the things they needed to know was, is this person using again? Because we all know that people, I don't know what the right word is, but recidivate, fall off the wagon sometimes when they've been addicts. And so it's important to know whether that's happening so you can decide whether to remove a child, for example, or what to do. but they didn't have any drug test kits like they had had a decade ago. And so they raised this issue to me of, we don't have portable drug test kits, and we're instead giving vouchers to people to send them off somewhere with a transportation voucher, a voucher to get a drug test. And, days, weeks, who knows how long would go by not knowing. And by the way, if somebody doesn't want you to know, they're probably not going to do as you've prescribed. So I give that as an example because we've restored those. We are restoring those drug test kits to those caseworkers to make sure that they have that available to them. There are many more things that we had to address, but that's one example, of what we needed to do in this budget. DCFS, MAP grants, continuing our ability to get more kids to go to school. If you want to deal with what people sometimes call the exodus in the state, one of the biggest sources of exodus, people leaving the state, is young people who choose to go to a college or university outside of Illinois. They're from Illinois. They leave the state of Illinois because they get offered more affordable college opportunities somewhere else. So we've got to address that with MAP grants. So many other things, efficiencies that we brought to the table in this budget. We found $225 million and more, frankly, of annualized reductions that we could make, efficiencies that we brought. And so I look at this budget and think we are trying to build on the progress that we made last year, focus on the things that really matter: education, healthcare, jobs, and so on, taking care of our most vulnerable people, and balancing the budget and making sure we're addressing our need to fund the pensions, for example, and deal with all the other financial pressures that the state is under.
Great. So, Governor, obviously there have been lots of folks who've reacted to your speech today, and a lot of it that I've seen speaks to the tax increase that is proposed for these programs, as well as the graduated income tax proposal that's on the November ballot. What do you say to those folks who say that this budget is not the answer?
Well, let's start with, this is a tax cut for many people in the state. The middle class and the working class who pay taxes in our state are paying too much. And the people at the top 3%, are paying too little. And so the proposal here, necessitated by a structural deficit that exists in our state, is that we tax in a way that most other states in the United States tax, and that's on a graduated basis. I put that forward in the spring of last year, was put on the ballot for the voters to decide about in November. Rates were passed, so people know exactly what those rates will be. And $3.6 billion of revenue would result if it passed on the ballot in November. But it was important, there's a timing problem that exists here. The fiscal year begins July 1st, and it's not till November that a decision would be made about revenue and about whether the graduated income tax would, in fact, be the law of the land and an amendment to our Constitution. So I put forward a budget that would account for either alternative, but it is a budget it's a single budget. It's a budget that addresses all the things that we should do, that we want to do in the state, and it also provides for a reserve in the event that the fair tax does not pass in November. So we'll have to address that when the time comes in November. But we've made sure to protect very important things to the state, and also look forward to a day when there might be the revenue for us to do the things that are additionally important.
Your predecessor, Governor Rauner, one of his budget proposals included like $4 billion for grand bargain spending. In other words, we'll let them work it out. Some people are comparing
I think you called that working together.
Yes, well, there you go. As we know, didn't exactly happen, but some people are saying that your budget, which has, scenario A with the tax increase and scenario B without is similar to that, is it?
Not at all. In fact, I think that the people who are saying that are the Republicans themselves who backed up Bruce Rauner in his effort to destroy the state, frankly. And the impasse that he brought to the state was because he was unwilling to work with people, and what he proposed was something that was unworkable. So what I'm proposing is something that's workable, whatever the outcome in November is. We've made sure that we have two paths here that could be followed depending upon whether the voters approve the constitutional amendment or don't. It's actually a very responsible budget, and it prioritizes the things that I think the state needs to have prioritized, the very things that make us stronger as a state over the long haul. I'm really focused on the long run for the state. We want to educate our children because ultimately what builds economic growth for our state in the future, jobs, is the talent that we develop in our state. Are we doing it well or not? We have been historically doing it well. But as the years have gone by, and especially over the 4 years that preceded me, we've defunded our universities. In fact, we've defunded so many things that matter to the future investments that need to be made. And this budget that I proposed, in fact, responsibly invests either way in the things that really matter. In higher education, MAP grants, either way. In DCFS, we're investing either way because we've got to protect those most vulnerable.
A word that came up from a lot of Republicans today, including Jim Durkin, is hostage. Tim Butler in his state, and the idea is by saying that this $1.4 billion in funding will come off of these programs, including $150 million from education, when you need $350 million to meet the new requirements of the new funding formula. Here's what Tim Butler said in his statement: you're essentially holding our service providers, local governments, educational institutions, and taxpayers hostage for his political agenda. Again, it's like, is it not holding over the whole General Assembly? If you don't pass this, these cuts will happen, or these expenses will not get made. They are calling that a hostage situation. Is that fair?
They're trying to equate something that Bruce Rauner did in being unwilling to pass a budget to remember why Bruce Rauner was at the business of what he did. He was trying to destroy labor unions in the state, and he held the state hostage, the state budget hostage to that. That's far from what we're talking about here. In fact, today we're talking about very responsible budgeting. And indeed, I look forward to working with Republicans, as I did last year, in order to make sure that we're meeting the requirements of a balanced budget in the state. I put forward a balanced budget. If they have other ideas about how we ought to pay for the things that we want in our state, I am all ears. I would like to work across the aisle to make that happen. I proposed my solution to that with the fair tax, but I am willing to work with anybody to make sure that we're doing what we need to do to pay the bills. Remember, when I came in office, I am all about being responsible about our state budget. When I came into office, there were $8 billion of a bill backlog. $8 billion. We have reduced that bill backlog by $1 billion over the last year. That is the direction we need to go. We're making sure that we're investing, like I said, in the things that actually grow our economy, because ultimately that brings revenue into our state. If we grow the economy, more people have jobs, people make more money, they have the ability to, provide revenue for the state under the laws that we have even today. So I'm excited about the opportunity to work with Tim Butler and others. I know that there's a moment where partisanship seems to take over whenever a speech gets made on anything.
He does say he's willing to work with you here.
Well, good.
On the other hand,
I appreciate it. Yeah, but I think it's disingenuous, frankly, for people who voted for Bruce Rauner and who supported his hostage taking over 4 years to somehow imply that I'm anything like that.
So you mentioned the $8 billion backlog in bills, and then the backlog in late payments and such. While you've made a dent in those bills and those late payments, those are still some huge numbers.
They are.
How long is it going to take for the state to get its fiscal house in order?
Well, I would like it to take much less time.
Yeah.
That is, again, why I've proposed and supported the fair tax. I am focused on fiscal responsibility. And, if you think about it, we have several things that need to be addressed, and I'm addressing all of them. For example, again, you talked about the bill backlog. You have to address the bill backlog. We have to address the structural deficit. It's a real structural deficit. That means that regular revenues do not meet the regular expenses of the state. And once again, this is after the hollowing out of state government that you have this situation. So those are two things to keep in mind. Remember, we're on a payment ramp for the pensions that demands roughly $500 million of additional investment in the pensions each year. And that's something that we have to pay, that we owe that to retirees. It's our job to make sure that we pay that. And then schools, if we want to have good schools, and if you want to lower local property taxes, you want to fund schools properly. So when you look at those four things, those are four extraordinary, if you want to talk about the fiscal future of our state, these are four hugely important subjects, and I address all of them in a variety of ways, did so last year, continue to do that this year. Again, back to your $8 billion, down to $7 billion of a bill backlog. I want to pass the fair tax in part because we need to address those four major areas. There's a lot more to do in our state, but if you want to set our fiscal ship in the right direction, if you want to make sure the foundation is strong, we've got to pay down that bill backlog. And we've got to dedicate ourselves to dealing with, addressing the pensions properly. One last thing about pensions, because I want to highlight this. It had been more than 70 years that people were tried to consolidate local police and firefighter pension plans across the state. It was ridiculous that we had 650 separate funds, very small funds sometimes, $2 million, $3 million, all across our state. They were investing separately. They were getting very low returns. As a result of low returns, the property taxpayers in those local municipalities had to make up the difference because of the low returns. So I brought everybody into a room. Dan Hines oversaw it, along with a business person from Chicago, the head of the firefighters union, the head of the police union, the head of the Illinois Municipal League, and others. They were all in the room together. These are people who usually sit on the opposite side of a table from one another. They sat in a room together and they worked it out. It took them a few months to figure out how they would get this done. And, there's a lot of Sturm und Drang in the end, to everybody wrangling over something or another at the end. But in a bipartisan fashion, people who disagree with one another came to an agreement about something nobody had done this for 70 years of trying. It had been impossible to get done. We got it done. So to me, that is evidence that, what I'm doing to try to bring people together, to try to, reach across the aisle, get people to find solutions to sometimes intractable problems is working, and we can do that with our pensions.
So going back to the original question, though, is, with all of that said, how long?
So let's talk about the numbers here just for a moment. The fair tax provides about $3.6 billion of revenue to the state. Again, we'd be lowering taxes on most people, the vast majority of people in the state, middle class and working class people, and we'd be raising taxes on the very wealthy in the state, the top 2.7% of people in the state. That $3.6 billion, a portion of that, let's call it $2 billion, needs to go to address the structural deficit of the state. And we could argue about whether it's 2 or, a little bit more, a little bit less. But so you start with that problem that needs to be solved. And then you've got, other dollars here that need to go to the things that I just described. We've got to address the bill backlog. It's ridiculous to me that we pay such a high interest rate for not paying the bills, and that people go months and months. In fact, during Bruce Rauner's term, they went years, or at least more than a year, for many of them getting paid. And for a small business, that could mean you're going out of business. And that's also true for a Medicaid provider, a doctor, or somebody else, right, going out of business. So we've got to make sure that we're bringing that down, and so a good portion of that remaining amount should be going to paying down the bills. Let me say one other thing, which is in our budget for this year, we are going to, well, it looks like, and there are a few months left in the year, but it looks like projected that we'll have more than $100 million of a surplus for the first time in a long time. $100 million, more than $100 million of a surplus in the FY20 budget. We should take that money and put much of it toward paying down bills. You can try and do your own calculation of, well, when can you get, the bill backlog down to where it needs to be? If we do all of those things and manage our bills properly during the year, and what I mean by that is we can also refinance, and that's been done before too, right? So we get a lower interest rate. Instead of paying 12% on these old bills, we can refinance, pay off those old bills, and pay more like a 3.5% to 4% rate. For that, right? And that's another thing that we ought to do to reduce.
Instead of the 12%.
Instead of 12, yes, right. You're replacing a 12% rate with a 3.5% to 4% rate.
That would take legislation, right?
Well, no, yes, I guess in the end, it takes an approval by the legislature, but it's a bond issuance by the state, yeah. But we've been doing that, by the way. That's in part how the bill backlog was brought down to where it is now, because it was up at $16.7 billion at one point, 16.7 billion under Bruce Rauner. It's now only at 7.
If I could just ask a question about education funding in particular,
Yes.
because the formula does call for $350 million. There are people who usually like you, like Andy Manower, who said it's concerning that you're talking about possibly just giving $200 million instead of $350 to education, K through 12, if you don't get the new tax passed and into effect in January.
Mm-hmm.
And Advance Illinois, Robin Staines, she has a familiar last name. She calls it she says the FY21 investment strategy is devastating if you're only talking about the possibility of $200 million instead of $350. So is it possible to make sure you get the $350 no matter if the tax passes or not? That's what even people who usually support you are saying.
Yeah, well, look, again, one has to look at all of the needs of state government, the required expenditures, the things like paying our pensions, and the things that are what fall into a discretionary bucket for the state, and that includes public safety and education, human services, right? Those are all things that people put in the category of discretionary. And it's very important that we make decisions about where would you put your priority. And so I would suggest that a $200 million increase, I'm for putting more money into schools. I believe that the fair tax would allow us to do that. And not only that, but we should put more than $350 million a year into schools. That $350 million, which is a recommendation that comes out of.
It's not mandatory.
It is not. It is not. It's a recommendation, but if there's less than 300, and in this case it would be 200, less than 350, it would be 200 if the fair tax doesn't pass. That 200 actually gets reprioritized, making sure that that's according to the formula in the law. It gets reprioritized to the schools that need it most. And I prefer the $350 million and more because there are, again, two things we're trying to accomplish. One is we're trying to bring our school funding up to where it ought to be. Remember, Illinois is 50th out of 50 states. We're last in the nation, last in state funding for education, last. And that means that property taxes are necessarily higher because in many places people want a good school and they're going to pay for it with their property taxes if they have to. But in most states, in the average state in the United States, half the money for schools comes from property taxes and half from the state. In Illinois, it's 24% from the state, not half. And so we need to continue increasing the amount that we're putting into schools, in part because it's good for the schools and in part because it alleviates local property tax pressure.
Governor, I'm wondering, you really noted the downstate Chicago split. And I wonder what prompted you in the budget address to make that sort of statement?
I'm very disturbed by people who want to divide this state. I'm disturbed by people who want to divide the country. But I look at the state of Illinois and I think that Carbondale, Quincy, Peoria, Cairo, Chicago, we're all one state. We belong to each other. That we may have different people with different jobs, different experiences in different parts of the state, but I'm very disturbed by the politicians who go out there and they use this division, this rhetoric of dividing our state as a weapon. And I think I've heard recently that, one of them anyway was recorded by somebody saying, well, he doesn't really believe it, but he just says it everywhere because it helps him get reelected. And I just think that's wrong. I think it's the kind of thing that we have too much of going on at the national level. Illinois is better than that. So I'm prompted to say it in almost any circumstance, but I'm especially, when I think about the resources that need to be distributed around the state, I focus a lot on downstate Illinois because I think that we've done too little to create jobs in downstate Illinois, historically, I mean. Too little to invest in mental health services and healthcare in general. And that's why I've done a lot to strengthen the funding for those critical services across central and southern Illinois and frankly everywhere outside of Cook and the Collier counties, everywhere of course in the state. But I think a lot about downstate Illinois, and the revitalization of downstate Illinois is something that I have come to believe significantly. And last thing I'll tell you is I traveled the state as a candidate. I went everywhere. Some places I had never been before, and as I was running a statewide campaign. And I heard many of the same things over and over and over again. These are things you don't hear in DuPage County or in Kane County or in Cook County. About the needs of the rest of the state, of the agricultural communities, the rural communities of Illinois, and I was taken by the need to address those, and so that's what I've been doing.
So how do you convince people that and what in your budget will show people that there is true concern for places, south of Springfield?
So look at what we did last year, for example, with regard to critical access hospitals in southern Illinois. We strengthened funding for those hospitals. Look at what we're doing in the capital bill, where we put, I insisted, this was my personal project for the capital bill, and that was expanding broadband internet everywhere in the state. One of the $420 million, that's more than has ever been put into broadband in our state. And one of the reasons is, think about the things we can do with that across rural Illinois, across the cities and towns in downstate Illinois. One example, telehealth. So we talk about the lack of healthcare services. If you need a specialist and you live in some areas of southern Illinois, you may not be able to find that specialist. It may be 5 hours away from you. And yet, being able to access a specialist over a telehealth network is something that would be enormously advantageous for people who are ill, who have, very concerning illnesses where the expertise doesn't exist in the immediate area that you live in. Being able to access those kinds of things, being able, as a child, a parent of a child, to access an expert at Lurie Children's Hospital in Chicago when you live in someplace like Vienna, that's vital. That's life-saving potentially. But again, it requires investment in broadband. So you're asking me, what are the proof points of the governor thinking about southern Illinois? These are the things that I would argue are the proof points. We also expanded, and I think did a great job of introducing the new industry to agriculture. For example, growing hemp. Across the state. That was something that didn't exist. It got approved before I became governor, but it had to be implemented, and our Department of Agriculture did a terrific job of speeding up and implementing the permitting that needs to happen for that industry. So there are many things that I've done that have focused on, and those are some examples.
I'm wondering about whether there were additional funds for state police or somehow local police to handle the revocations of void cards? Not confiscating, but I guess reclaiming those weapons attached to them.
So this is a very important issue, as you know. People who've had their FOID cards revoked should not have a weapon. They're asked to turn in their weapon. Many people just ignore that. It's also a dangerous endeavor for state police or local police to go remove a weapon from somebody's possession. So it is a difficult endeavor. And yes, we provided funding for state police to expand the number of state police, because in order to effectuate the revocation, the removal of a weapon, you need to send multiple officers to a home in the event that someone is resistant. And we have steadily, before I became governor, there was a steady diminution of the number of troopers in our state police. We introduced 2 new trooper classes last year, or in this fiscal year, I should say. And in fact, there are 3 proposed in the coming fiscal year. So adding personnel and making it a priority, as our head of state police, our director of state police, Brendan Kelly, has made. I think many of you have covered his discussion about FOID cards. It is going to take a lot of coordination, though, between state police and local police departments in order to address the thousands of revoked FOID cards where people still are said to have a weapon.
If I could ask a overall budget thing, you're still going to get a lot of people saying, certainly on the Republican side and the business groups, that we don't need the extra tax. The State Chamber said that by showing a budget without the 1.4 in reserves, the administration has made it clear to Illinoisans that another ruinous tax increase is unnecessary. But because you
This is at the same time they think they're saying that somebody's holding a hostage? Wait a minute.
I don't think they said, I don't think they use
all
the
right.
hostage language.
Yeah, all right, but they're
you're
all
still-
on the same
so-
side,
So
yeah.
interestingly, I know that you still have opposition to the tax. I know that you can't use state resources to tell people how to vote, although you can hint.
Right.
So
No.
how do you get, where do you go from here? I heard other Republicans saying, we don't need more taxes, we should live within our means. There were cuts that you asked each agency to come forth with, like 8.6 or whatever. Where are those cuts? And why do we need a tax increase? So how do you sell it and why do you need it?
Yep. So I first want to point out that listen, my door is open for Republicans to come in and tell me where they think we should cut. They never do that. They just say, cut it and let us know. I would love to have the conversation, because when you're inside the agencies, and I have terrific people that I brought in to run our agencies, and we asked them as an important exercise to look at their agencies and tell us, where would you cut? If you had to make substantial cuts, where would you cut? And they came forward with a number of ideas. And the question is, of those ideas, which ones are fat, which ones are muscle, and which ones are bone? And so you start with the question of, when you think of an agency like DCFS, is there anything that we can cut at DCFS? Of course there are things within DCFS, but in the end, if you can cut, you need to redeploy those dollars, because we need to build up DCFS's capabilities. In other places, we made substantial cuts. I mean, a good example of a savings that we brought was just again, I talked about this a bit in my speech, which was by not negotiating with the labor unions, the AFSCME and other unions that represent state workers, by not negotiating. And I know his intention was to try to destroy those unions and get them to capitulate. But by not negotiating, he left on the table the potential to save hundreds of millions of dollars in healthcare costs. If you negotiate, you can get those. And we did. We were able to get $650 million of savings. So, the 6.5% request of all of our agencies to come up with cuts allowed us to take a look at things that you could within those agencies. And we did, as I had
Is that the 220 or whatever?
in a single year, with hundreds of millions more that you could bring to the fore. An example that we put forward, and again, I'm open to conversation with the business community about how best to do this, is merging the Department of Employment Security with the Department of Labor. Many of the things that they do are actually very much the same. Some are different, and we want to make sure that we're managing our unemployment insurance properly. And I know there were concerns on the part of business. Well, gee, there's an agreement that comes, regularly, that has to come between labor and business on what those unemployment insurance, programs look like. And my door is open to that. That's why we didn't insist on it. It's not written into the budget. We suggested it because we think there's a good idea here, and we want to get it right. And so let's listen and then do it the right way. So I think again, to the people who say, well, just cut, and, and then you'll have everything right when you cut. I would suggest, let's go look through the agencies. Why don't you come with us? Take a look at the things that we see and tell us, which mental health care provider you think we ought to not have on our rolls, or, which service you think we ought to take away, or whether you want to cut MAP grants or what. Let us know. Happy
Maybe
to
it's
talk.
inflation, but they say it's getting bigger this year than last year, too. So,
What is?
the budget, I mean, it's over where it was by a couple of billion, is it not?
Yeah, but let me just point out again, take away the reserve for a moment. We can talk about both, but take away the reserve. There are some required expenditures. We talked about the pensions. We're on it. We have a law on the books. We're going to pay $500 million more. Tell me how you'd like to cut that, if that's what they're suggesting. Okay, there's $500 million there. There are consent decrees that have been, some of them, in place for a couple of decades. A few of them, in fact, more than a few, were put in place during Bruce Rauner's term because of a failure to meet many of the requirements. And those have become more stringent, and we have to make investments in those in order to meet the court's requirements. So again, there's some natural things that need to be addressed in our budget, and those are built into the budget, even when you take away the reserves. Yes, sir.
What can you do in places like Cairo and St. Louis? And I really am a long way from knowing what is happening there, except for every time I go to Cairo, it's worse and worse.
Yeah.
And I'm not even sure that East St. Louis is still able to run their own housing authority or community development department or what have you. And it used to be the state had a say in whatever was going on. But they can't sell City Hall anymore. But there's still a lot of things that go on.
What can we do? Yeah. So this eats away at me. It's something that I have focused a lot on. One of the things that we've done, let's talk about Cairo for a second, is in the capital bill, there are opportunities for us to invest in job-creating capital projects, not just in the building of those projects, but in the ongoing business that will come from them. There's a port opportunity to be invested in Cairo. Cairo sits at a very important juncture, as you know, of rivers, and it's an ideal location. And so within our capital budget, we have a reservation of $150 million for ports.
And we have, of that 150, we have identified, I think it's 40 million for the Cairo port.
And so the idea that we can now go build something that will create jobs for people who live in Alexander County and in Cairo, a place that has seen population exodus of significant numbers. One time, not long ago, there were 20,000 people who lived in Cairo. There are now 2,000 people who live in Cairo. We can bring business to an area that has been neglected for far too long. East St. Louis, I'll just point out, we have an opportunity to bring investment dollars into the opportunity zones that were created within East St. Louis. The Opportunity Zones are a federal program that was created that is a real advantage for people who want to invest their capital and get a tax break. And so we've actually held investment conferences to bring dollars in to look at, I can think of at least one business plan that have been put forward. There's more than one, but one that I can think of. Business plans have been put forward for East St. Louis on the river for kind of a redevelopment of riverfront property in East St. Louis. These are the kinds of things we have to look for. It's job creation, right? New opportunities for people to earn, capital investment from private dollars as well as from public dollars. Those are the things that I think are going to build up areas like Cairo and East St. Louis.
Is the 40 million already in the capital plan and has it been announced, or where is that?
Yeah, it was in Rebuild, Illinois.
Okay, so it's known in the territory.
Yeah.
Along those lines, there's been more discussion of a downtown university presence. Was there anything in the budget relative to that? There was some talk about that, or is that all part of the?
I think we only, in the Rebuild Illinois plan, I think there's only the money that's allocated for the armory, but maybe you want to address that.
Nothing
Specific to those university campuses. I know there's lots of discussion among the universities and with the city of Springfield, but I don't think there's anything specific in the.
Do you have an opinion on using that like 4 square block area, including this annual club, and redoing the whole thing for classes or whatever they're gonna do?
Only that it should be people who live in Springfield, who live in the area, who should make the decisions about what kind of development they want to bring.
I have one last question here, and it is, I've been here since December. I come from a neighboring state,
Which one?
Indiana,
Welcome.
that was beneficiary of a lot of the bad decisions that were made in the past with getting businesses that relocated from Illinois to Indiana, taxpayers who said that taxes were too high in Illinois and they moved over to Indiana for lower property taxes.
Yeah.
So what do you say to those folks or people who are still here who are considering, either business or residents who are considering making the move out of state because of the tax situation here?
Well, now is precisely the time for people to reinvest themselves in the state of Illinois, and here's why. Number one, we are, in fact, addressing property taxes in the state in a variety of ways, but one of them I talked about, school funding, for example. Trying to lower property taxes is very important because if we can lower your property taxes, we can increase the value of your property. We increase your wealth if we lower your property taxes. That's just a fact. And as you say, if you live on the border and you can see a home from where you live, or you drive by one that's just like yours and you're paying lower property taxes there, you may say, well, I can live not very far away. And so we've got to address property taxes. This is a problem that's been around for a long time. And again, it's very much related, I just want to remind you, to this fact that Illinois is 50th among the states in state funding for education, because your property tax bill is on average 60% of it is funding schools. So if we can lower the pressure on that 60% number, we can lower your property taxes. That's important. So that's one thing. I mean, there are things about the way that we calculate property taxes in the state, the PTEL calculation, and decisions that can be made at the local level about consolidation of local units of government that we should be going after. I talked about those in my State of the State speech. I think that people who live in a local area and they want to collapse or get rid of a unit of government that they're paying taxes on should have the ability to do that, and they don't today. So these are all things that it seem like intractable problems. Nobody's been able to go after them. I'm trying to address all of the big ones. But to your point about Indiana and other states, I'd say another thing. This is the greatest state in the United States. I mean, we have talent that other states don't have. We have universities that are better than the universities in other states. I happen to think we have the nicest people in the country that live in the state of Illinois. And I really believe that the kinds of investments that we're making in job creation, remember we have the lowest unemployment rate in our state's history right now. We have wages rising in our state. Every region of the state of Illinois, jobs are growing. Every region. That's very unusual. And southern Illinois, which often gets forgotten, is growing faster than any other region. So altogether, I would say people want to live in a place where they have good schools. They want to live in a place where they can get a good job that pays a good wage with opportunity for a better job sometime in the future. They want opportunities to get skills that'll get them a higher wage. And I think they want to live in a place where we're investing in the things that make families stronger, like early childhood education. We do all those things in the state. We're doing more and more of that in order to make this a state that people want to move to.
Is there, because property taxes are assessed at the local level, there's no guarantee anybody will really lower them, is there, other than incentives you provide by, the police and fire pensions or whatever? Is there anything that you can say, as governor says, absolutely property taxes will go down? You can't really say that, can you?
Well, I mean, we could talk about legally what you could do. Let's start, though, before we get to the legal things, to the laws you could pass about that. Let's just say that people who live in a local area don't want to pay higher property taxes. And so if they knew that their schools were going to get funded properly, and oh, by the way, we increased funding significantly last year, and we're trying to do it again this year. If you address all the pieces of a property tax bill, or the major ones, infrastructure spending, right? Your local roads. Guess what? We addressed that last year. You're going to get more money for your local roads and your local community. We're addressing schools. I talked about that. We're addressing the big pieces that people pay along the way. Pensions, we addressed that, right? Those are big three things that are on your property tax bill. Well, then your local government, which is something that you vote on, should be responsive to the idea that that your local municipality is getting those funds from the state, and it should be able to lower property taxes. There are people who have suggested that we could pass, a property tax freeze, or to require a lowering of property taxes. We can change the PTEL calculation.
Tax caps.
Yeah. And there are many places that are reluctant to lower property taxes because that will lower the cap. And then they won't be able to recover from that if they need the money later. Maybe we ought to make adjustments to that. So those are all pieces of how you get to lowering property taxes. But until you address these things like schools, and fund them properly, you ultimately, local governments are going to have to pay for these things somehow. And so we've got to alleviate that pressure. And I'm going at, like I said, in each of these areas, I'm going after them because this is how you get to the solution. You can't just talk about it. And you can't just say we're going to issue an edict from state government and not actually provide a change in the way that you fund the needs of local government.
So am I allowed to say? Despite your speech today, the guy that got all the attention was really Rod Blagojevich. Given the situation I'm just wondering, a controversial president, released from prison, a controversial governor, do Democrats or Republicans in this state, because you watch the political thing, benefit from this, or who benefits from this among Republicans and Democrats in Illinois? Can you say?
I think,
as an election comes up?
You're saying, what will the impact be on the election? Is that
Yeah.
your question? I couldn't tell you. I mean, I think, I really can't tell you what the effect is. I mean, listen, for the last 3 years, the politics of the country have been topsy-turvy at best. And I don't think I've been able to predict anything about the direction things would go. I can say this, that in 2018, I felt very much as if people had awakened to the idea that Donald Trump was attacking the foundations of democracy. And people showed up at the polls in numbers that they hadn't shown up in a long time, especially in a midterm election. And so I think in the end, that's what's going to happen here in 2020. We're going to have an overwhelming turnout because I think people desire change. And I think they're disappointed with the direction of the country. Disappointed isn't even the right word. I think many people are angry about the direction of the country. So I think these crazy things that the president does just feed into people's understanding that, we're losing the foundations of our democracy and that we need to regain them and
Was the connotation
activate.
one of those crazy things?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, it was clearly something designed, in a state where we're clearly having to deal with, and it's time for us to deal with the corruption that's existed in state government, that, to release, someone who's, a prime example of that.
Yeah, I gotta say, obviously, some people are bringing up that you had some embarrassing conversations with Mr. Blagojevich when he was governor, when you were talking about different jobs. Does that have any effect on your effectiveness at this point?
No, I'm focused on, listen, that happened 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago, in fact. I'm focused on, I wake up every day trying to think about how do we solve these major problems for our state. And we're making progress. I feel good about the direction of the state, and we should feel good about the direction of the state. We have these, challenges, there's no doubt about it, but, and I think about them all the time, but in every way, we are addressing them. You almost can't name an area in which we're leaving aside that is part of the fundamental problem of our state. But if you can name one, I'll start working on it.
Well,
Thank you.
Governor, any last thoughts before we close?
I just want to express my gratitude. This is, I have had the opportunity now several times after giving a speech somewhere, usually in front of the legislature, to come here shortly after last year when I gave it was a combined State of the State budget speech last year. I came here and, I appreciate the welcoming environment. I appreciate that there are community members that are part of the discussion. So I would just say, as I have often said, I know people think I'm an unrepentant optimist, and maybe there's some truth to that, but it is also, I'm a pragmatist, and so there were people who said you can't solve the problems of the state of Illinois when I was running, but I must say, we can. We are on a path to do that. You asked the question earlier, speaking of the backlog, how long will it take? What I can say is if you're making progress every day, that's what you would hope for, that not moving backward. And the best way to do that, bipartisanship, working together. We used to be a state where Democrats and Republicans actually talked to one another and did things together, and we did that last year. Mm-hmm. And we can do more of that. It's, I know, against the grain of the rest of the country, or at least the national environment, but it is very much who we are in Illinois, and I'm going to keep doing it. So,
Great.
thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, good to see all of you.